Hello and welcome to this video on making a coffee stout. This is a recipe that takes advantage of the flavors of a stout and amplifies them, or perhaps reinforces them. That is because stout often has a very strong bitter flavor from the dark roasted malt. This is also sometimes called a chocolate malt. For this we are prescribing what is needed for a 50-litre batch, but you can scale accordingly. Understand that what we are making will be very dry, so if you're after something sweeter, you may or may not need to adjust something like the pale malt we describe. For this recipe, you will need 4 kilograms or 9 pounds of malt, and we generally use a pale malt so as to get a more predictable result when you add the following to it. 500 grams or roughly 1 pound of caramel, chocolate malt and Munich malt each. You will also need about 200 grams of roasted barley and coarsely ground barley. Finally, you will need an ale yeast, yeast nutrient and hops, with Cascade being a common example, but you might also want to use Saz, Nugget and more that have a strong aroma and bitterness, which can be achieved by choosing a high alpha acid cultivar. Understand, the aroma is primarily what you are using it for, not so much the bitterness. The stout will already be quite strong in flavour, so it's really only what you're smelling on top of that you're aiming to add here. The coffee part of this can either be added during the fermentation or boiling stage. Just be aware that you may wish to compensate for the oils in coffee by adding lactose or another ingredient to improve bubble formation and the consequential head when pouring. We suggest by starting to combine your malt. This is the 4 kilograms of pale malt, chocolate malt, Munich malt, caramel, and the barley forms that we've described. You now want to boil it until the gravity reads about 1.065. In reality, if you're using pure malt extract, then you won't need to worry about this. You only need to worry about that if you're using grains. If it's malt extract, you should reach this value just by dissolving everything in water. Next we add the hops. These are added now as the flavour is not key, but you want the aroma. You may also wish to reinforce this later by dry hopping, but we'll touch on that at the appropriate time. You now boil for about 10 minutes to extract the flavours from the hops and ensure the sugars come together. Once your mash has cooled to about 20 to 25 degrees Celsius or 77 to 86 freedom units, start to pitch your yeast. You may choose to pitch it at as little as 20 degrees or 68 freedom units. The exact temperature you choose to pitch your yeast will basically be anything a few degrees each way of 25 degrees Celsius or 77 freedom units. You may also wish to add yeast nutrient at this time, and now you need to allow a day for the yeast to start working. You can, if you wish, add the coffee at this point, but we suggest giving the yeast some time to start working first and get used to their environment. There are ways around this, such as pitching a liquid yeast culture, but for now we're assuming the simplest approach. While the yeast starts working, cold extract the equivalent of a large cup of coffee. After this is finished the next day, and with the yeast working away and settled in, add your coffee to the stout, if you've not already done so at the boiling stage. We use roughly 1 large cup, or about 250 milliliters or 8 ounces, to each 4 liters or 1 gallon of brew, so in this case we're looking at somewhere between 12 and 13 cups of coffee. Now you need to wait until the fermentation is finished. This will take between 7 and 14 days depending on how much you are fermenting, how active the yeast is, environmental temperature, and similar. Once you've completed that, you can look at adding hops now to dry hop it. This will again vary on the hops you are using and how strong a flavour and aroma you want, again primarily focusing on the aroma. In the end, what you are going to get is a very toasted malt flavour, with a few more sharp notes from the coffee added and the lighter smell from the hops. It will be a much more bitter beer than most others, barring lembic or sour beers. This, however, is not from bacteria, but ingredients. It will also be a much darker beer than you may be used to. Understand that these are features of it, not defects. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.